What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to The Robust Opposition. I am so thrilled to be doing this interview today with one of my all-time heroes, Bill McKibben, a huge leader in the environmental movement. He's only given me a half an hour of his time, so I'm not going to read his extensive bio, but I will put it into the comments. I do want to ask you a couple of questions, Bill, about your background and some of the major things that you did before we get into what you're working on today and the solutions that we need, including the tactics that we need to take. So first, I want to tell you that I was surprised to find that you grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, because I was the program director of the cable TV station there in the early 80s, programming the public access stations. What in your background and growing up made you so concerned about nature and the environment?
Well, it's funny you should talk about Lexington. In fact, Lexington played a pretty formative role, I think, in my kind of political sense of the world. My summer job for years was giving tours of the battle green where the American Revolution began. The tourists would come into town and high school kids in tricorn hats would meet them to show them around, tell them the story. And I think it was very good for me, Lauren, because I never was confused that dissent was somehow unpatriotic. In fact, in the kind of context of Lexington, just the opposite. So I think that actually was an important beginning for me. My parents, my father in particular, was a great lover of the outdoors, an early member of the Sierra Club. And so we spent a lot of time hiking and things, and I'm sure that had some lasting impact on me. But my original work as a journalist was fairly urban, and I wrote the Talk of the Town column for the New Yorker when I got out of college. So it wasn't until I was 26 or 27 and writing The End of Nature, the first book about climate change back in the late 1980s, that really this all started to sink in.
Well, The End of Nature was where I first learned about climate change. And it was really, of course, we called it global warming then.
We called it the greenhouse effect back then. I'm so old, I can remember calling it the greenhouse effect.
It was such a seminal book in popularizing this concept to the world. When did you decide you needed to do more than just write? You've written a lot of books, but then you did the Step It Up campaign and you founded 350.org.
It took me quite a while to figure out sort of what was really happening here. I think because I'm a writer, my initial assumption was I should be writing more books and more articles and things because this is an argument. And if we compile enough data and enough papers and enough symposiums and things, eventually our leaders will wake up to what's going on and will take action. It took me a while, too long, more than a decade, to figure out that we'd won the argument. You know, scientists were in robust consensus about what was going on. We were just losing the fight because the fight wasn't about data and reason. The fight was about what fights are always about, money and power. And the other side in this fight, the fossil fuel industry, had unlimited amounts of money and hence of power. And so we were going to need to build some power of our own to match them. And that's when we started trying to build movements. Step It Up and 350 were early iterations of what's now a big, broad, robust movement with the youth climate strikers and the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion and Mothers Out Front and, dozens and dozens and dozens of great groups all over the world.
Let's talk about the People's Climate March of 2014, because my son, who was actually going to boarding school in Vermont, took a field trip down to that. And I was so jealous of him. I watched it, Amy Goodman's live coverage on Democracy Now! You did an interview with her. But there was some criticism of that march by Arun Gupta, specifically in Counterpunch. He criticized it for trying to copy the energy of Occupy, but with the branding and paid staff and banks and corporations marching in it. And the more radical action was Flood Wall Street, which he mentioned you started to promote at the end. And I'm sure this was the interest of the influence of Avaz, which is, after all, a branding and marketing organization. But when you look back on that march, which was probably almost as big as the original Earth Day, there were like 156 events around the world and over 600,000 people participate. When you look back at those climate rallies and marches, and I've been in a lot of them myself, do you think that they do more than just make people feel good about marching and carrying a sign and then posting it on social media? Maybe they raise awareness, but how do you think those marches actually achieve change?
Well, I think that there's lots of things that achieve change. And in that case, by the way, I don't think there was any corporate branding or corporate sponsorship or anything. It's pretty grassroots, and it kind of flowed nicely. That was on the weekend, and then on Monday morning we were down in Lower Manhattan to, as you say, flood Wall Street. So that was a good segue. I think that there are moments every once in a while when you need to come out and show that there's a real big strength to a movement, that there's a lot of people in it, and that can change the zeitgeist some. That's what happened on the first Earth Day, which 50th anniversary of which we've just celebrated. On the 20 million Americans went into the streets that day. It was about 1 in 10 of the then American population, and those numbers were large enough that they changed the flavor of our politics. It was over the next few years that Richard Nixon, a conservative Republican with no interest in the environment, signed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and on and on and on. All the acts that the Trump administration is trying to get. So I don't think doing mass marches all the time is a great idea. We've done a lot of civil disobedience and sending lots of people to jail, and that's been effective. I don't think you do that all the time either. We do every kind of activism we can think of. I think probably you don't want to pull any tool out of the toolbox all the time because they can get literally and figuratively dull.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk to you about, is a theory of change and activism, where we're going to get the most change, which tactics we're going to use. And what you are most known for, I think, is surrounding the White House and getting arrested and spending 3 days in jail. Recently, you tweeted out an article by Wen Stevenson about the strategic importance of nonviolent civil disobedience. And Chris Hedges, who I discovered during the Occupy movement, believes that that's the only thing that's going to create change at this point, because all the institutions that we've depended on to represent our interests have been either corrupted or co-opted. I've been referring back to this amazing Mario Savio quote when he was on the steps of Sproul Hall at Berkeley in 1964, where he said,
"There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all."
So do you think that in order to save ourselves with the time that we have left, we literally need to step up the type of civil disobedience we do, from getting arrested surrounding the White House to actually doing what people like the Tar Sands blockade did, which is chaining themselves to the bulldozers, when they were constructing the Keystone XL pipeline?
Well, I think that nonviolence in all its forms is extraordinarily useful. My last book ended with a long description of what I thought were the two most important inventions of the 20th century. One is the solar panel, and the other is the nonviolent social movement. And, they came from the fringes of society, from people without a great deal of power, the suffragists, Gandhi, Dr. King, so on and so forth. And they're remarkably important. You have to think, I think, about how they operate, why they're so useful, because if you don't, you can sometimes, I think, get them wrong. One of the reasons that they're so powerful is that you're appealing to people who are looking on and who see you willing to undergo a kind of unearned suffering. And that changes people's understanding of the importance of what it is you're talking about and opens their hearts sometimes. So you don't want to use it all the time. And I find that you have to be careful about how much anger is a part of it, because somehow it seems to work best coming less from anger than from a kind of love. But situation by situation, place by place, all different ideas. And I'm really glad that people are experimenting with lots of nonviolent civil disobedience.
So specifically related to things like chaining yourselves to the bulldozers or some of the things that the water protectors did in Standing Rock, you don't have.
Yes, I thought that was terrific. I had the great pleasure to get to be at Standing Rock some. And I thought what they did was enormously important. It's not that you can stop this machine physically. You can stop it for a day, but it, if that's all you're able to do, then it grinds on over you. But what you can do is wake up other people to what's going on. So the most important images that came out of Standing Rock were unarmed men and women and children sitting in fields while the oil companies and their hired security guards turned German shepherds on them. And those pictures were almost frame for frame, identical to the pictures from, say, Birmingham in 1964. And that's one of the reasons I think that the White House and the Obama White House and things woke up to what was going on at Standing Rock. It rekindled a kind of historical memory because of that bravery. So that strikes me as really key.
Earlier, you referenced Trump's rolling back all the environmental protections that we were able to achieve 50 years ago. And Richard Nixon was really responding to the zeitgeist of our times. He would probably be considered a moderate Democrat today. The Republican Party's gone so nuts. But I want to talk about the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi called the Green New Deal the Green New Dream or whatever, derisively. Joe Biden had a very weak Green New Deal plan. He attended a fundraiser hosted by a fossil fuel lobbyist and told his donors, quote, "Nothing will fundamentally change." He's now taking advice from Larry Summers, who's been terrible for the environment. I know you became disillusioned with Obama. Do you have any reason to believe that the needed changes will be made under a Democratic administration? And aren't you just a little bit mad that Bernie threw in the towel before half the primaries were held?
No, I'm not mad at Bernie. I like Bernie an awful lot. He's my fellow Vermonter and I think a very brave guy who has accomplished a lot and will accomplish a lot for us all. And so Biden wasn't my candidate, but I think that, the good news is this week he was sitting down for a long time with Jay Inslee, the governor from Washington. And they were talking a lot about what parts of Inslee's really groundbreaking climate proposals would be adopted in the platform going forward. I think that I don't perceive politicians, even ones I really like Bernie, as saviors. What I perceive them as is opportunities. So in any given election, you elect the person who you have the most chance of pushing to do the right thing, and then you push them. So I don't think there's any chance of pushing Trump to do the right thing. I think his reign has been 100% destructive beginning to end. I think there's a pretty good chance that we can push Biden to do some stuff. Not everything we need, as I say, wasn't my candidate, but I look forward to being able to push him the same way we did Obama around things like Keystone. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think politics ends on November 3rd. I think in some sense, what we do on November 3rd is see whether we get to have any politics for the next 4 years or not. So that's why I'm going to be doing everything I can to beat Donald Trump. Also, I'm not sure I can psychologically survive 4 more years of watching him. Telling people to go drink bleach is kind of the reminder of just what a crazy world we're currently living in.
100% agree with you, but I really feel that the Democratic Party, which I exited in 2017, clearly showed, and Obama had a role in this, consolidating around Biden, that they are more interested in reelecting Trump than they are in winning with Bernie. That's my opinion. I want to switch over to Michael Moore's film, The Planet of the Humans. It was problematic, and it was especially harsh on you. And I feel like you ably rebutted that. And for people that saw that film, I'm going to put your rebuttal into the comments. But I have to say that having fought some of these big green groups, not 350.org, in my campaign to get a California legislator to withdraw her weak fracking regulatory bill and fight for a ban instead, I know how foundation funding can make big green groups limited in both their demands and their tactics. Michael Moore's film does make great points about how we need to be limiting production and consumption, and that going from dirty capitalism to green capitalism isn't going to cut it. These are the very same points that Naomi Klein made in her great book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. Do you think that the environmental movement needs to be more anti-capitalist? And do you think the fact that foundations who fund the movement are funded themselves by wealthy capitalists precludes such a call?
Well, I don't know if it precludes it. It doesn't in my case, but that's because I've never taken any money from 350.org or any other environmental group. I think actually the environmental movement's been pretty good about trying to stand up on these things. Naomi and I launched this fossil fuel divestment movement in 2012, and it's become, I think, the biggest corporate campaign of its kind in history. I think as of now, we're at about $14 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. And it's taking its toll. Shell Oil said last year that it had become a material risk to its business, which is good because Shell Oil's business is kind of a material risk to the planet. Earlier this year, the coal companies, when they went begging for a bailout, said that divestment had basically made it impossible for them to raise capital to keep expanding their business. So I think those things are pretty good. I think that we're right now taking it sort of to the next level and going after the biggest pillars of global capital. The huge banks, insurance companies, and asset management companies that really provide the funding lifeline for fossil fuel. I have a piece in the New York Times this morning urging that everybody unite to try and oust the the lead director of the board at Chase Bank, biggest fossil fuel funder in the world, their lead director is a man named Lee Raymond, who used to be the CEO of ExxonMobil, and was instrumental in telling people not to worry about climate change at precisely the moment when we should have been worrying about it. So I think that those things are really crucial. And that's why I spend my time volunteering at the moment really hard on this stop the money pipeline thing. I think if we can crimp the flow of money to the fossil fuel industry, then we've got a fighting chance.
Yes, I have two questions about that. But I do want you to address my question about green capitalism.
I've written a lot about economic growth and whether we want to continue to have a economy that who makes constant growth its mantra. And I don't think we do. I think we need, I wrote a book called Deep Economy that tries my best to kind of get at my sense of this. I think that we're in a world now where there are other goals besides growth that need to be prized: stability, security, resilience, hardiness. And I don't think you can do those just by, slapping a green coat of paint on what you've got now. I think we need to be asking some very fundamental questions. I think they end up being about things like localism, about levels of consumption and so on. And these are things I've campaigned around and worked on all my life. So I'm glad they're getting good attention.
I want to talk about the Stop the Money pipeline, because you have been doing a lot of work on getting these banks to divest from funding these fossil fuel projects. We had an action supposed to be at Chase. It ended up being virtual. A lot of people have been participating in car rallies. I've gone out and covered a bunch of car rallies. But do you think that this movement is succeeding because the price of oil has dropped so low? I mean, last week, the futures price of oil per barrel was negative. And now I think it's $11 a barrel. Similarly, with divestment, the UCs divested last year, and they said it wasn't because of moral reasons, it was because of financial reasons. They believe it's going to be a stranded asset. I never think that these banks and corporations do things for the right reasons. I always think they do it if it makes financial sense for them. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think they do things for what you would call the right reasons, but I think they do things because they're pushed hard by people to do them. And I don't think you should discount the work of all the millions of people who've worked really hard on things like fossil fuel divestment or on the Up the Money pipeline campaign. The oil industry the oil industry has been in the tank long before this pandemic, and they face two huge challenges. One is their product is wrecking the planet, and hence there's a big movement demanding change, and that's a big problem. Their other problem is that people are figuring out how to deliver the same thing that they do, energy, in cheaper, cleaner, better ways. That's what a solar panel or a wind turbine represent. And therefore, they're under enormous pressure there too. That's why they've been the least performing part of our sector of our economy these last decade or so. So all these things come together, but on pure economics alone, we're not going to get where we need to go fast enough. What we need to do instead is, and I think what all of us are engaged in, is trying to kind of force the pace of this action, force the spring, as it were. Because yeah, it's true that 75 years from now, the world will run on sun and wind and other renewable energy to the degree that it uses energy. Those are cheap and clean and good. The problem is that at the current rate of transition, it'll be a broken world that people are running on sun and wind. That's why we need to speed things up.
The environmental movement oftentimes is not in sync with the indigenous peoples movement. And I want to speak to their statement that they released on the last COP, which they're very opposed to RED. And I don't really have time to get into explaining what that is, but it's a market-based mechanism similar to carbon pricing and cap and trade. Cory Morningstar, who has a blog called The Wrong Kind of Green, The Art of Annihilation, she wrote an article about you in 2011, and I just want to know if this has changed. The article was called Why I Refuse to Promote Bill McKibben. And she said, it must be remembered that Bill McKibben, 350.org/OneSky, and most other big Greens have rejected the People's Agreement of Cochabamba rather than unite behind it in favor of the false illusion of green capitalism. The People's Agreement stated that the richest countries should not have an ecological footprint 5 times bigger than the planet can support. And it also called for the rights of nature. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot because you're a total hero of mine, as I've said, but is it true that 350 back then did reject this People's Agreement, and do you support it now?
No, it's not true. And yes, we've worked extraordinarily hard and close with indigenous groups all over the world, in every continent. Those are some of my best parts of my life as a volunteer activist, have been the opportunities to work really closely with indigenous communities. And I think they've probably emerged as really the crucial leaders in a lot of ways. And it's been especially powerful over the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years. You know, people were surprised, some people, by Standing Rock, but I wasn't. The people who were there leading it had been in the forefront already. So in this continent, Dallas Goldtooth and Melina Lubacan Massimo and Crystal Lehman and Clayton Thomas Muller and, Tara Huska and Winona LaDuke and Deborah Parker and, just on and on and on down a long and illustrious list. It's really been in certain ways, the great pleasure of my life these last decades to get to work with a ton of these people. And it's important to realize that it's not just true in North America. I mean, our colleagues say the Pacific Climate Warriors, which is what 350 is called in the South Pacific, represent the indigenous people of islands that may not exist before this century is out. But their slogan is, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And it's been a great honor to get to fight alongside with them.
But as far as the solutions, which we should be talking about now, what are you asking Congress and world governments to do? Have you rejected these kind of market-based solutions?
So the things that I am most interested in, working hardest on, are 1, big government support for rollout of renewable energy, and 2, keep it in the ground. That's kind of the work in helping pioneer for a long time. It's physical reality that we have 5 times the carbon in our reserves as any scientist think could burn, so it better out. See more and more of that starting to happen. Even the current residential calls for an end to any new oil and gas drilling on public land this year, which would be a big deal. U.S. public lands taken on their own are, I think, the 4th or 5th largest source of carbon in the world. So we're not as far as we need to be, but we're getting there, and I hope that people will join in this call.
Now, what about 2 other issues, militarism and animal agriculture? Because the U.S. military emits the most greenhouse gases, and animal agriculture also emits a lot of. Do you think we need to be addressing those 2 things?
Good report last year on emissions by the military that I got to write about. I wanted to highlight it, so I wrote about it for the New York Review of Books. And it was very powerful. What's interesting is the U.S. military is the largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, as you say, but it amounts to well less than 1% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the world, which is a good reminder of just how spread out our use of fossil fuel is around the planet. I mean, you're standing before a backdrop of LA, and it's a reminder every day in normal times of just how much gets used just by people going back and forth to work or whatever else. I think the biggest thing to do with the military is to try and get them out of the business of defending oil around the world. I think that's largely been what their job's been for the last few decades. I think it's come at an extraordinary cost in wealth and an extraordinary cost in lives. And I think it's time for it to end. As for animal agriculture, I think it's a very, very good idea for people to eat the food chain. And some people, that means that they become vegans. Other people means that it takes syndrome. I'm trying to help these people at a thing called the reducitarian movement over the last little while, because I think they're probably on to something that it may be easier for a lot of Americans to half the meat they're eating now for reasons of both environment and health. And that might add up to something that really mattered fairly fast. So we'll keep working on that stuff. I think the most important thing that individuals can do is be a little bit less individual and come together in the movements large enough to make real change in the course of things.
During the Democratic primary, the corporate media and the establishment Democratic candidates always asked Bernie how he was going to pay for all his ambitious plans. But we now see with the coronavirus pandemic that there's plenty of money to pay for things when the powers that be think that the problem is a crisis. Do you think that the climate crisis will have to get so bad that people are dropping dead in the streets before world leaders recognize that we need to change?
Well, people are dropping dead in the streets. I mean, you remember in California, it wasn't 18 months ago that we lost how many people in the course of a single morning in Paradise? How many people whose lungs were badly damaged by the wildfire smoke all over the West Coast. So people are already there. I think the biggest difference between the coronavirus crisis and the climate crisis is there's not a $1 trillion industry invested in making you sick with this virus. There is a $1 trillion industry invested in keeping things going the way they're going in our energy system, and that we have to beat them in order to get the political change that we need.
Are there any final words that you want to offer the viewers, reflections on Earth Day 50 years later? We've made a lot of progress in some areas, but we've gone backward in other areas.
Earth Day in 1970, as we've said, was extraordinarily successful in tackling the problems that they faced, which were mostly dirty air and dirty water. And the reason is that people fought very hard and that those problems yielded to relatively easy technical fixes. A catalytic converter on the car, better filter on your smokestack. The problem that we face to that kind of change. Carbon dioxide turns out to be a lot harder than carbon monoxide to deal with. What we need now are pretty fundamental transformations of the kind that you've been talking about. So that means we need to mobilize in numbers at least as large as those of 50 ago, and we'll see if we can.
I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
My pleasure.
I just want to tell viewers, stay safe, stay home, and keep fighting, and share my show.